Time to move on now. Next, we are delighted to welcome Peter Hill, who appropriately, as it's St. David's Day, is going to be talking to us about Welsh dragons. Peter's been passionate about UK amphibians and reptiles since childhood, creating his first pond at the age of 8. Since then, he has worked in the field throughout the UK, both observing the animals themselves and also creating and restoring habitats for them. Peter advises the Welsh Government and National Resources Wales with regard to amphibians, reptiles and their habitats, and for the past decade has been employed by amphibian and reptile conservation, championing amphibians and reptiles in Wales. So thank you, Pete, over to you.
Thank you very much. And it's really good to be here with you all and to see some familiar faces and some new ones. I'm just going to work out the technical stuff. I shan't be long. This screen. There, I think it just takes, there's a bit of a delay with everything, isn't there? Okay.
Yeah, we can see that fine, thank you.
So we're going to talk about the reintroduction of the sand lizard, and it is appropriate to St. David's Day, being a dragon. I'll tell you about what we've been doing in Wales with ARC. It's basically my colleague Mark Barber. We got together many years ago with mutual interest and set up a group for volunteers, and things went from there. And myself, my father was a Welshman in the army down in the south of England, and so where I grew up as a very young boy was on the southern heaths of Surrey, Hampshire, and regular visits to Dorset. I'm autistic, I have Asperger's, and I wasn't diagnosed until quite recently, not long ago, a few years back. But as a child, I was obviously undiagnosed, misunderstood in school. I was in the top classes, but I wasn't very well behaved because I was misunderstood because of my behaviour. But what I was doing a lot of, when I should have been going to school, was out looking at reptiles. Some would say obsessively. I'd prefer to say with an intense interest. So you can decide. Anyway, I found my first sand lizard as a 9-year-old, and basically spent 20 years watching them and observing them down in southern heathlands. And then when I moved back to Wales to follow my roots, it was around about the same time that the reintroduction program of the sand lizard, the official reintroduction program, was embarking in Wales. So I moved back to Wales pretty much about the same time that the sand lizards did. And it's been fascinating making comparisons with them living in the Welsh dune habitat compared to southern heath habitat. And hopefully I'll be able to give you an insight into some of that. As well as my colleague Mark, we've got George, who's recently joined us. George is a fantastic young man. He's incredibly skilled and experienced field naturalist. Spends an inordinate amount of time out looking for stuff. He's also a very keen birder, and he's been an absolute asset to the team. Also in North Wales, I've got a fantastic colleague, Mandy. She moves heaven and earth for amphibians and reptiles up there, pretty much unaided, not as much as assistance as we get here. And she's very much in control of looking after the reintroductions and the management of the natterjack populations in the North Wales sand dunes there. She's very busy doing that, as well as great crested newt work and monitoring the sand lizard reintroductions up there. A very busy, capable lady. Here she is, in fact, with one of our patrons, one of ARC's patrons, Chris Packham. There she is, correcting his mistaken idea for grass snake, correcting him as to regard its gender. It's always good to do that. So we spend a lot of time in Wales looking after great crested newts, and thankfully they're not at the stage where they need reintroductions, but it's generally a lot of habitat manipulation in strategic locations. Nothing surprising, pond creation, restoration, etc. There's a lot of it going on. Actually, we just came to the end of this year's spell on a license. We had an active license which expired yesterday, and we've been doing a lot of work for the meta population in Monmouthshire on 3 different NRW woodlands. So lots of ponds gone in this year as well. And there's another species we work with a lot. It tends to be the reptile species which is suffering most currently with regards to fragmentation, and seems to be declining faster than any of the other reptile species. So we do a bit of ride restoration creation, increasing light levels, increasing structural diversity at ground level, etc., as well as more strategic stuff with land managers trying to influence land management, etc. But some species, that isn't enough. Some species need reintroducing, particularly if they're extinct, if the habitat is survival for them. So ARC, as a UK organisation, we've got a good history of reintroductions. 4 species: the natterjack toad, various different areas of England and Wales. Pool frog, it's focused on that, been going on since the early 90s, mid-90s, sorry, specifically in Norfolk. Smooth snake in the south of England, and the sand lizard, various different 5 counties in England, some of which it became extinct at, and of course Wales, it became extinct everywhere in Wales, so it's a complete reintroduction to Wales. Natterjacks, they're a very, very special species. The best way to understand them is to completely disassociate any connection with common toads. They're nothing like common toads. Their ecology is very, very different. They require a sandy habitat, various different reasons, basically because they function at warmer temperatures and breed at warmer temperatures than our widespread amphibian species. So they're specialists. Sand dunes being the exclusive Welsh habitat for them. They do live in southern heathlands elsewhere and some other habitats in England, but when we're talking about Wales, certain coastal sand dune systems that also boast the slacks, quite often in the frontals, where you get the very, very shallow, not very vegetated and temporary pools that the natterjacks use to breeding. So they want something very shallow, so it heats up really quickly with very few predators in it. But areas of the coastal dune systems in North Wales are incredibly suitable for them. And as you could see earlier, my colleague Mandy's very busy with them there, and they're doing very well. Pool frog, this is an English project down in Norfolk. Much like the natterjack toad, it needs warmer conditions than our widespread species, and it's quite specialist. So there's these pingo ponds, ancient Ice Age formations, pingos in Norfolk that they established, we've established them in. Very different to anything we've got here, not to be confused with the various other European subspecies of pool frog, which we've also got here in various parts of Britain. Some of them Spanish, some of them French. There's all kinds of a mixture going on, but they generally look very different to these guys. They're generally very green. Okay, if you see a frog leap from the water and grab a dragonfly out from the air, it's not a common frog. It's one of these guys or one of the other pelophylax species. And smooth snake, of course, Britain's rarest reptile, none in Wales, but very successful reintroduction happening in various parts of England. We translocate adult animals. That's how it's been working, with a lot of sensitive research before, during and after. That's because captive breeding them is not very realistic because they feed on reptiles primarily. So translocation works with them. With natterjacks, we translocate sections of spawn string. We don't translocate an entire section spawn string. We take sections from each string, so there's diversity. And that's all we do. We translocate the spawn strings for 3 years solid, then they tend to be able to get on with it themselves with the right management. But of course, the sand lizard, what we're really here to talk about, we go about things in a different way with sand lizards. We can breed them in captivity because they don't feed on lizards. They feed primarily on invertebrates, so it's pretty easy to replicate a natural diet for them, supplemented with commercially grown insects, which are always dusted with vitamin supplements, etc. And the key drivers of, well, the people who produce most of the animals for reintroduction are actually specialist volunteers who breed these animals in private vivariums, outdoors, purposefully designed for them. So the animals live 12 months a year outside as they would do in the wild. It's basically an artificially designed, well-drained section of south-facing sand dune that's enclosed. And the animals are monitored, that when the eggs are laid, they're incubated and the youngsters released elsewhere. So let's talk all about that. It's our rarest lizard, okay? Absolutely, completely extinct in Wales, possibly late 50s, early to mid 60s. We don't know exactly when. It's very difficult to know these things because sand lizards are not only notoriously challenging to detect, they're regularly, constantly, I know due to the emails I get on a regular basis, regularly confused with common lizards. Common lizards are incredibly diverse in appearance. They come in basically every color you can think of, and they're regularly confused for them. So what's different about sand lizards and why are they so rare? Well, for a start, the sand lizard is right on the edge of its range living in the UK. Elsewhere in Europe, it's got quite a vast range with subspecies as well, including. Elsewhere in Europe, it lives in very different habitats. The ambient temperature is warmer, so it doesn't need to depend solely upon habitats that are sandy. In Europe, they're called things like the fence lizard, the garden lizard, stuff like that, okay? In Britain, because they're right on the edge of their range, the only place the sand lizard can persist in the UK habitat is where the substrate is sandy, okay? We've all felt how warm the sand gets on our feet on the beach in the sun. That's the medium for incubating their eggs in. That's the medium that they can burrow into to escape from extremes of temperature. That's the medium that they can bask on and heat up really quickly. So a sand lizard that needs to bask to be able to function properly, if it can bask on a little patch of bare sand that's already been pre-warmed by the sun, literally inches from cover, it's going to get a double whammy. It will heat up incredibly quickly. It will be heated up from the belly upwards, and it'll be heated up from above with the sand beating down on it. So they don't need to bask for very long before they're off moving around again. Incredibly, notoriously challenging to spot them unless you're obsessed with seeing the things. Southern heathlands, that's where they're typically more associated, as I told you about the sandy heathlands of Dorset and Surrey. But it's a very different kind of animal that lives there. They're different race entirely. The southern races, much darker animals. So in England, you can see that the vast majority of animals in colonies, including reintroductions down and south. But then we've got some up in Ainsdale and up Sefton Coast above Liverpool, completely separate from the others. These animals live in coastal dune systems. They're different to the southern sand lizards. The same species, not enough research has been done to study them, to decipher whether they are an absolute subspecies or not, but they're certainly a different geographical race. They look very different, and it makes sense because they live in a very different habitat. It provides the same fundamental resources and conditions. There's a different vegetation type, different floristic composition, different kind of sand, but it's basically the same thing going on, okay? And it's, having spent a half my lizard watching life on heathlands and a touch more of the remaining half on dunes, it's a darn sight more difficult to find them. on dunes. It's incredibly challenging. There's far more places there could be, far more places to look. They tend to be not so thick on the ground, and they're incredibly camouflaged, and they don't want to be seen, as you can see with this individual. Look at this female. Can you imagine trying to find her? Look how she's lined herself up against the lines of the marram grass. They really don't want to be seen. Here's a comparison view. So the animal at the top, an animal I photographed down in Surrey. That's a male, a heath-dwelling southern heathland race male. Bottom left, I photographed this chap up on the Sefton coast. You can see he's very different. That's a northern raced dune-dwelling male, much paler, less, less heavy-bodied as well. We think they're slightly morphologically different, slightly longer legs, slightly slimmer, okay, compared to the southern softies. I don't mean that, but can you see something else slightly different about them? The top animal, the heathland one, he's got ticks, various different places. I don't think I've found a single southern sand lizard at some point in here that hasn't got at least one tick. Sometimes they're covered in them. Conversely, in 23 years of looking at animals on various different dunes up and down the UK, including Wales, I've found one animal with a single tick on it. That's something I haven't got any answers to. It's just an interesting observation. It's not only mine. Other field naturalists agree with me. That's something to look into. Here's some females, southern race in the top, dark, heavily patterned, chunky. And the animal at the bottom left, northern race female, more delicately pastel coloured, I think. And that female, I photographed her at Innislas in Ceredigion, so right in the heart of WWBIC territory. Looking a bit closer detail of sand lizard habitat for you to understand better. So ectothermic animals, entirely reliant on an external heat source to function. So they have to thermo-regulate. It's a posh way of just saying move and away from heat sources and regulate their temperature. So here we can see we've got undulating topography, banks, quite steep banks, which provides what we refer to as thermal momentum. It heats up quickly. Same reason we've got our solar panels slanted. And that slope provides that thermal momentum, that sun trap, that shelter from the wind, but it's also got dense, mature marram, full of invertebrates, full of opportunities to get away from heat when required, interspersed with small areas of bare sand where they can thermoregulate, heat up, close to cover, close to forage, sheltered from the wind, burrow away from extremes of temperature if they need to. It's sand lizard heaven. It's what they need. Emergence in the spring. There's a male emerging. He's not in the least bit green, the one on the left, but he's got a much broader, bulkier head. A female emerging a little later in the year, the bottom right there. She'll actually probably get bigger than him, but she's always got a smaller, more delicate head and a larger torso. Makes sense because she's the one that's got to carry eggs. So the torso tends to be longer and bigger than in case of the male. There's a female on the left emerging. She looks quite bulky. That's because she's literally spread herself out flat to absorb as much heat as possible, both from below and from above, to spend as little amount of time as possible exposed like that, so she can move away and get on with other aspects of her ecology without any risk of predation. So when they are basking, they make it as effective a process as possible. Next to her is a recently emerged male. He's not at all green, as you can see. It's unusual to see them like this. Normally the males emerge significantly earlier than the females. They need to bask and develop viable sperm before there's any point the females even meeting them. So it tends to be a fortnight or so before. But here we see a male and a female at the same time, which is quite unusual. Climate change, etc., etc. A few weeks later, in April and May, this is what the males look like. Absolutely stunning, far more brightly coloured, in my opinion, and vivid than the heathland race. Almost a lime green. They look Mediterranean, don't they? And you can see the male there at the bottom, he's investigating the same burrow that you saw the female in earlier on. It's exactly the same photograph later on in the year. So they use their tongues to taste the air, follow scent trails, which are left along the sand, because the females' stomachs are dragging on the sand, and they leave pheromone trails all around the place, and the males follow them everywhere, in and out of burrows. It's fascinating watching them at this time of year. They're very active. Here's some Heathland race animals mating. It's much more difficult to get that on camera in the dunes. There's normally a load of marram in the way. Okay, but my good friend Vaughan Matthews photographed this. I took him to a site under my license down in Surrey. So you can see a bit of courtship there on the left. Romance is still alive in the lizard world, you can see. And actual copulation on the right. We saw this female mate with 3 different males in 15 minutes. They're very fecund. It doesn't happen for long. If you think of sand lizards, males and females, like a Venn diagram, there's a tiny strip in the middle where they coincide. And this is when it happens. Ovipositing, laying eggs, basically. It's a female I photographed mid-process there. She is. I kept my distance and managed to back away and leave her, fill it all in afterwards. Tends to be in the evening, as you can see with the long shadows. Yeah, she'll lay her eggs about 4 to 5 centimeters deep. When she's finished, you won't have a clue that they're there. She's very good at disguising them. And then they're left to incubate. Captive breeding, we excavate them, as I said earlier, and we incubate them artificially. And our dedicated volunteers that do this, they're very much dedicated to getting the right kind of food for them. And you can see how quickly they can get the youngsters to grow on a good diet. So in September, they're ready to be released into the wild. Here's an animal I photographed on the Sefton coast, a year old. You can see he's regenerated his tail there. So that's what they look after, like after a year in the wild. Get some scale there with a rabbit dropping by its head. Here's the releases. We get as many people involved as possible, publicity, etc. This is all going on in the North Wales sites and ongoing. There is a quick look at where we are with them in Wales. Official reintroduction sites in yellow, and some guerrilla rewilding happened in Anglesey. So maybe we could applaud the effort, but to be honest, we have to be cautious about this. The main reason being, people who have the skills to breed and produce these animals very rarely just keep that species. There's usually a biodiversity risk because we don't know what else they're keeping as well. So yeah, it's not something we rush to agree with, but it needs research. We've done a lot of research on them. This is up in Anglesey, Newborough Warren and Aberfrau. I myself personally have been involved with the surveying there. They're certainly there and they're increasing. So I would say that reintroduction didn't happen too long ago. In other news that I can't talk about in any great detail as yet is there is another population being discovered in South Wales, right in the heart of WWBIC territory. We don't know how it got there. We think it's been there a good deal longer than the Anglesey ones, on the account of the spread and the sheer numbers of animals there. Remember, they can go unnoticed in places for a long time. It wasn't until a herpetologist went on holiday there that they were discovered. Anyway, we've had the Institute of Zoology involved. We've caught a sample size of animals back in 2019 before lockdown. They've been tested for diseases, etc. Currently, they're looking at the DNA content. Can't say anything else about that. You'll all know as soon as we know more. We'll know about the decisions that the Welsh Government and NRW will make when we're better informed. Management for sand lizards generally involves providing sand for them to be able to lay their eggs, etc. And quite often it's needed, well, it's needed far more often generally on southern heaths than on dunes where they should be self-managing, even though it's not the case so much these days with climate change, all kinds of other anthropogenic pressures on dune systems, etc. But dune rejuvenation, you'll hear about dynamic dunescapes, Sounds Alive projects, entirely necessary. We get involved with those. We're generally there for surveys beforehand, during and after to make sure sensitive species don't get impacted, such as sand lizard. But you can see how quickly simply digging a sand patch can bring in a female sand lizard. We've been doing this at Abu Dhabi with volunteers by hand. We don't need to do it in a slash. The dune system now itself is managing itself pretty well at the moment. Abu Dhabi needs assistance, it's quite fixed. But we've been training up, despite lockdown, we managed to move around it somehow or other. Last year, managed to train up 2 different gangs of very lovely people, very close to an Islas. So you should be seeing records in the future. They're all accredited agents now on a survey license. So we should be seeing more about sand lizards coming in. The good thing about sand lizards is they have individual back patterns. Now, these photographs were taken during research with Institute of Zoology. We don't go around diving on them generally, but this was in order to get genetic samples for them. So as you can see, you've got male, female, male, female, female, male, female, male on the bottom there. Very individual, but can you see the back pattern running down the spine in between the 2 dorsolateral stripes? You won't see 2 the same. They're like fingerprints. So unlike great crested newts, where you have to catch the newt, turn it upside down and look at its belly to see its pattern, you don't have to do that with lizards. You can literally take a photograph of their back pattern without disturbing them and keep comparing it with previous pictures. And you can monitor animals over the course of time. There's animals in a slash that I've seen, individuals I've seen 4 seasons on the trot. It's great to see old friends when you've traveled 2.5 hours to see them. So we've had 76 sand lizard translocations, 65% successful, 15% ongoing, 12 limited access, various different reasons, 4% failed, 4% currently we don't know. So not bad so far. And it's been a lot of work. 9,000 animals, probably more than that now, released, restored to Wales. That's the important thing, back in Wales where they were extinct. So just quickly, currently in Wales, we're working on a Connecting the Dragons project. We had some interruptions with COVID, but we're targeting these species, and you can see sand lizard is among them. All the usual great crested newt stuff, lots of good results. Lots of other stuff, being more strategic with influencing land managers and trying to change attitude. My colleague Mark did some good work with a university and Chris Packham and Yola Williams, and they released a video about Adam the Adder without pictures of actual adders, with animations, so people didn't have to actually see snakes, because some people can't deal with it. And that seems to have got a good response. So it's hard championing a venomous snake, but we're managing it somehow, and we're trying to shift the attitude. And sand lizard, of course. And as I said to you, I've been identifying, recruiting and training and mentoring, which is really important. We don't just train them and then leave them in at the deep end. I've been going out mentoring them in order to be able to submit sand lizard records, hopefully with photographs as evidence. So you might see things changing. And grass snake, encouraging people to create egg laying sites for them. That's one of the biggest conservation measures we can make for grass snakes. And send the records in about it, of course, and common toad as well. Particularly with restoration of breeding ponds, we've done a few, and identifying areas where they're crossing the roads and getting squashed in huge numbers, just trying to get people involved with that, monitoring it. Toad size, because they seem to be shrinking, animals not reaching the sizes they used to. That's perfectly understandable. General theme with amphibians and reptiles these days, I'm afraid. Anyway, thank you for listening, and I hope you feel a little bit more enlightened regarding the sand lizard. It's a bit of a mythical beast. Very few people get to see them, especially on dunes. But as you can see, they are out there, and they're closer than you think. And they're doing very well indeed at Islas. I've been monitoring them there for just over a decade now. Personally, very encouraged with the spread they've made there. It's looking very good at Islas. Thank you.